there's a context. The context is the debate is, does fat, particularly animal fat, or sugar cause diabetes? So he cited studies which are important that show in World War I and World War II, for example, when sugar was not available, the rate of deaths from diabetes went down. Then it went back up again. World War II, less sugar, went down. So in 1975, when he wrote his book, The Saccharine Disease, it shifted the debate to say pretty much the main cause of diabetes is excess sugar. And he showed that within 20 years after white flour, white sugar, and junk food are introduced, then there was an outbreak of diabetes. So he made a pretty strong point. Now, recent research is suggesting fat really does play a role, particularly animal fat. So my sense it's both, but then let's go a little further. Why is it that now children who are 6 months old are coming with type 2 diabetes? See, he didn't have to deal with that. It's called pesticides, herbicides, environmental toxicity, which poisons the beta cells of the pancreas. So it's a little bit more complicated. Nevertheless, sugar, as far as I'm concerned, is the main cause, but not the only cause. Animal fat is right up there. And then environmental toxicity. So, and then you can go further. We have EMFs, we have cell phones, cell towers, all can actually stimulate diabetes. So there's more than a few things happening, but sugar's still, I'm going to say, still the number one. So that's how we look at it. But this is after World War II. He was the chief medical doctor for the British Navy. You know, the life was different then than it is now. So I think that's the important kind of overview to understand. It's more complex, and but in general, your diet is the main driving force for creating type 2 diabetes. It's the world diet, which is white flour, white sugar, junk food, and I'm going to say a pretty high and increasing slow meat-centered diet. Well, I think they're almost a little out of date, okay? So we're probably at that level now. The whole diabetes picture is moving much faster than we thought. We're close. I'm going to just say estimate. We're close to 400 million people in the world, 370 to 400 million people with diabetes now, and it's rapidly escalating. Okay, primarily because of diet, but I'm not eliminating the increased environmental toxicity. So that's how I see it. Now, when we look at the demographics, it's the leading country is India because they just have so much sugar. And then China, and then finally the United States. These are the three top countries, and Indonesia is the fourth. And really, sugar is still a increasing junk food, and sugar in the diet is a predominant factor in the story. But again, there's more to it because of the environmental toxicity and lifestyle and EMFs and different stresses. So we'll go back to sugar in the diet, and the demographics show that 27% in the United States of people over 65, 27% have type 2 diabetes. So we got to see how it's already now, okay? We're looking at approximately 116 million people with type 2 diabetes, now we're talking about not type 1, and prediabetes. And about 30 million people with diabetes, and about 86 million people with prediabetes. But in 5 to 10 years, that moves into 50% become diabetic. Now, 10% of the population between ages of 20, and 60 also have diabetes. So we're looking at bigger and bigger numbers. That's what's really going on. It's truly an epidemic because people aren't changing the way they're eating. So it's a bigger picture. We're looking at an increased amount of children with diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, not type 1. There's a distinction here. Type 2 is environmental and dietary. So when we're looking at kids 6 months old with diabetes, who are overweight and so forth, we're looking at some kind of metabolic disruption. This is a different way of looking at it, which, as far as I can tell, and I can only estimate because nobody has the answer, is very much an environmental toxicity that's affecting the beta cells and killing the beta cells of their pancreas, different than type 1. It's not an antibody type thing. It's not an autoimmune type thing as type 1 is. So we've gone from 4% of the children to about 25% in the last 10 years. So more is going on, and it isn't simply that. Yes, the worse the diet gets, the more diabetes, type 2 diabetes we're going to get. So it's a bigger and sadder picture. Now the good news is when we go back to a normal, healthy, organic, veganic, I'm going to say live food diet, but just even veganic, that all turns around. The relationship of meat consumption to diabetes is the bigger question here. Part of it is it turns out that animal fat actually increases insulin resistance. That's been shown. And how does it do it? Well, it does it in a variety of ways, but it plays into the question. So first of all, animal fat by itself tends to destroy the beta cells of the pancreas. And we know, for example, with fish, people who have 2 helpings of fish a week have a significantly increased beta cell decrease function. In other words, it's killing the beta cells. Okay, so that's one. Second thing is animal fat accumulates in the cells, and it blocks intracellular insulin signaling, which is key, extracellular insulin signaling. It blocks the GLUT4 receptors, which receive the insulin in the cell, blocks them from migrating to the cell, and it also blocks their function. All these make the cells more resistant to insulin. So animal fat is a big player. Now, animal protein, we're talking about animal fat, has other problems. Animal protein has more estrogen. And this is a definite issue, is that we see people with diabetes, type 2, have higher estrogens, including the men. And the reason for that is insulin converts testosterone to estrogen. It activates aromatase, and that's a problem in itself. A lot of men who I treat with diabetes really have much higher estrogen. They actually start to grow breasts. And so we give them herbal supplements that build up their estrogen production. Literally, it's key understanding. So estrogen's a player. Low fiber in meat increases estrogen. It's really interesting that vegan women have half the amount of estrogen in their system because the vegan diet is higher in fiber that helps pull it out. So we're talking a few different things. We're talking about animal fat has a specific effect in blocking insulin function. Now, animal protein also has a problem. Animal protein is high in leucine and methionine. Now, that leucine and methionine disrupt the mTOR pathway. What's that? Well, it has to do with longevity and anti-cancer. Okay, so that's one part. So we know that diabetes is a chronic degenerative disease. In other words, it accelerates aging. So in general, that's what's happening. In specific, leucine which is much higher in meat, okay, actually kills the beta cells of the pancreas. So we have the meat fat having its effect, and we have the meat leucine and methionine blocking or killing the beta cells, and also we have meat having more estrogen. The other thing that meat does is it's inflammatory. And what we know with diabetes is it is a driving force behind diabetes is inflammation. So meat is adding to that inflammation. Meat also has what we call ages. Okay, and what that is, it's where glucose and fructose are bind unnaturally with protein. In diabetes, we see A1C, where the glucose or fructose is combined unnaturally with the hemoglobin. That's how we measure how serious your diabetes is. But it's a bigger picture because the whole body gets glycosylated. Okay, so the advanced glycosylated protein combinations are associated with increased rates of diabetes. Partly, it's because they create inflammation, they create oxidant, they create free radicals. So meat turns out to be, it's got its own ages, events, glycosylated in products. Key concept here. So when you eat the meat, fish, chicken, you're taking it into you. So not only do you have your own that you're making, but now you're getting it exogenously. So that's a little bit of a problem because now you're increasing your ages, and that makes things worse in the system, particularly increasing free radicals, creating oxidation, and generally inflammation. So these are there are multiple levels that we're looking at where meat is bringing the ages in, adding estrogen. It's low fiber, which speeds up how quickly sugar can get into the system. So there are many, many levels in which meat, fish, and chicken really accelerate the diabetes whole process. The research is pretty good, but the best study was with 12 studies from around the world, and they saw that there was a 35 to 50% increase in diabetes for meat eaters. In other words, what they really found is vegans had 35 to 50% less diabetes for all the reasons that I'm talking about. And these are pretty sophisticated reasons when you see the whole picture. So the other thing is that it actually, apparently, the meat protein itself stimulates an excess of insulin secretion, and that's associated with diabetes as well. It's a long story, but the key is the more insulin secreted, the body begins to resist it and then goes into insulin resistance, which is associated with diabetes. That's a long story made short in that. So it's many, many levels that meat, fish, and chicken create a problem here. The connection is that meat increases the amount of estrogen in the system, and excess estrogen tends to stimulate breast cancer. That's a direct connection. Now there's an indirect connection, and that is meat increases your rate of getting diabetes. Okay, and insulin secretion, which is connected with the early stages of diabetes, has insulin not only works to bring sugar into the system, but there's another piece here. It's important. You know, insulin is anabolic, and it tends to increase the rates of cancer in certain organs and tissues. Breast being one of them. Prostate, colon, endometrium, ovaries. So we have, and really pancreas. So there are certain target organs that higher insulin tends to create cancer, and breast being one. So that's the indirect cause. So there's really two levels of that picture. There are multiple levels of risks. First, you have radiation from Fukushima. And that itself isn't good. The research seems to see that all the fish in the Pacific, all, okay, are radioactively contaminated. Now, in terms of diabetes, we do know that radiation causes diabetes. In Fukushima, the Fukushima district, okay, the children under 12, 60% of them have diabetes. That's outrageous, okay, but that's what we're talking about. The research from Chernobyl, the Bohemian Islands, show a 200% increase over 10 to 20 years of type 1 and type 2. So we know radiation is associated with the diabetes. So those are big issues. So that's one issue with fish. Second issue with fish is they're very high in toxicity because they don't necessarily pee, and so they build up and concentrate the toxins in the water, such as PCBs and so forth. So when people eat fish, they're taking in a very high level of environmental toxins. That's two. The third is it appears fish fat is specifically toxic to the beta cells of the pancreas. So we're looking at, if you're having fish twice a week, we're looking at accelerated rate of the beta cells of the pancreas, which is what we need to produce insulin. So there are multiple levels in there. One of the most frightening things about the environmental toxicity is the sperm count has gone down. And just recently I read a report where it's about 50% of what it was 40 years ago. Now 50% is like 4 million something per cc. That is slightly above where we go infertile. So we think mostly it's the PCBs, but the point is there's a gradual decrease. A while ago, they saw 25% of college students being men being infertile, but now I think we're looking at higher. So we're really at a break point where literally fertility, in terms of sperm count, is we're just above, I'm going to say, where men become infertile. So it's extremely significant. Our pesticides, herbicides, and so forth are a big problem. Now, I think that's going to vary according to your diet. So what we know is, depend who's doing the study, but it's very close. 95, 96% of the pesticides and herbicides are in animal flesh, particularly animal fat. So if you're eating vegan, you're eating lower in the food chain. And so you're much less likely as a vegan man to have decreased sperm count. There is environmental toxicity, but the main place where we're getting the pesticides and herbicides is in the food because the animal's concentrated higher up in the food chain. So it may be, I'm joking, but not really, that the survival of the species will depend on vegan men in terms of sperm count. So we also have to note that the fertility of women has gone down dramatically as well. And in 2007 to 2009, when they did bigger studies, it was lower than it had been in 30 years. So there are connections, because the whole fertility cycle has to do with, is this an environment where the child can survive? So we're talking pretty significant changes. The question was about sperm count in a way, so what I just said is we're at the edge. I believe that's not the case for vegan men, because we are having less exposure to the pesticides and herbicides because we're eating lower on the food chain. Well, dairy consumption and diabetes really are two kinds of discussion. First, we're going to talk about type 1 diabetes. And in that, I'm going to bring in the vaccination question, because it's the same principle. What it is dairy has over 100 different antigens in it. Vaccine has hundreds of antigens too, so many foreign bodies. The body, particularly the young child, when exposed to these antigens, makes antibodies to combat them. For reasons we don't know, but in the same case, they end up making antibodies against the milk, which are similar to antibodies against the beta cells of the pancreas. And with the vaccines, it's the same thing. So these antibodies get made that are against the vaccines in the milk, but they end up attacking the beta cells of the pancreas. The percentages are pretty significant. When they began doing vaccinations in New Zealand, and I'm going to also mention Finland, we saw a dramatic increase in type 1 diabetes in children. The principle, again, it was with the Hep B, but also the MMR. I'm not going to do every single study, but the main point was about 60% increase in type 1 diabetes in those who got vaccinated, both in Finland and in New Zealand where the studies were done. So that's significant in terms of the picture, but the principle is very clear. Foreign bodies, the baby's trying to make antibodies against them, doesn't quite get it right, and makes antibodies against the pancreas. Now milk, we have research that's really been done in Chile and also Finland. And what we see with Finland has the highest amount of milk drinkers in the world. They also have the highest amount of type 1 diabetes in the world. So what we're looking at is up to 13 times, 11 to 13 times higher type 1 diabetes in Finland, and also we see it in Chile, where they're exposed to milk at an early age. And this is specifically children are given cow's milk at the age of 3 months or less. It diminishes after that, but that's where the big piece is. And that's why the American Pediatric Society is kind of recommending no cow's milk for up to 2 years. So what we're saying is, in summary, we have milk and vaccines are antigens. They stimulate antibodies to go against that cross-react and destroy the beta cells of the pancreas. That's really what the connection is. Toxins in drinking water are different than antibody-antigen reactions. The toxins in the drinking water, like PCBs, like fluoride and so forth, actually destroy the beta cells of the pancreas, number one. Two, fluoride actually increases a dysregulation of the blood sugar as well. So the toxins are disrupting, the environmental toxins are disrupting the biochemistry, but they're also destroying the beta cells of the pancreas. We also have lead, mercury, and cadmium and arsenic, which are big players in that. So these environmental toxins in different subtle ways destroy it. Mercury's the biggest one, the most significant one. So when we're working with adults but also children, the idea is to get the mercury out of the system. That's why I'm concerned with like the flu vaccine that actually has mercury in it. Well, that's not really good when you're thinking, how do we prevent diabetes? So the mercury is associated with destroying the beta cells of the pancreas. This is not a good thing. So the lower we can eat on the food chain, as I say, vegan, obviously fish are very high in mercury and so forth, avoiding any animal product, which fish that is known to be high in mercury, is a very wise thing to do. So we want to minimize our exposure, which means go vegan as the safest way to go about it. So fluoridated water has many problems. It lowers your IQ. It makes you, decreases your willpower. It's what the Nazis used in the concentration camps to do just that. It also makes you infertile. So it's affecting all your vital processes, but also, as I say, lowers your IQ, but also affects your emotional status, so you're more fearful, more confused, and so forth. Now, what does that have to do with diabetes? Well, it apparently disrupts the sugar balance in the body and makes people more insulin resistant and really disrupts the whole metabolism. So fluoride is a metabolic poison on all different levels, including the whole hormonal work mechanism associated with diabetes. In this overall context that we're talking about, vaccines have antigens in them. The body responds to the vaccine by creating antibodies. In its effort to fight the vaccine, sometimes it makes antibodies against the beta cells of the pancreas. So vaccines have definitely been associated in several countries with increasing the rates of type 1 diabetes. This is true in New Zealand. It also showed up in Finland. And it was first noted with the hepatitis B vaccine, but also later with the MMR vaccine. It's the same principle. The body makes antibodies against these things, which is the concept of vaccine, but it cross-reacts and ends up making antibodies against the beta cells of the pancreas. The data varies. Some people estimate as much as 147% increase in type 1 diabetes. Other studies show about 60% increase in the diabetes. So studies vary. The main take home is, yeah, vaccines, certain vaccines do increase the amount of antibodies against the beta cells of the pancreas and are associated with type 1 diabetes. Most of the research is done in New Zealand and Finland on this question. As we look at the diet in the world, a diet that's high in white flour, white sugar, junk food, and meat is directly related to the onset of type 2 diabetes. For example, China is really having an epidemic of diabetes. Their meat eating has increased 5-fold since 1950. They're exposed to all kinds of pesticides and herbicides, which are higher up in the food chain. So we're going to call it a worldwide diet because it's a worldwide epidemic. And this diet of white flour, white sugar, and junk food and high in meat is a world diet now. Maybe it started more in the West, okay. But the whole world has earned this, and that's why we have a worldwide epidemic of diabetes. So what are the problems? Well, the first problem is the meat-based diet, which really does increase, for a whole list of reasons, the rate of type 2 diabetes. Meat is high in estrogen, it's low in fiber, it has creates free radicals, creates inflammation. The fat, animal fat, tends to block insulin, causes insulin resistance because the animal fat blocks the intracellular, extracellular insulin signaling. Animal fat, particularly fish fat, tends to kill the beta cells of the pancreas. It creates a lot of problems. And the other thing is acidity. The research shows that when people are acidic, there's about a 50% increase rate in diabetes. So meat and junk food, white flour, white sugar, all increase acidity. So we have a multi-layered thing. The other thing about the meat is it's much, much higher in pesticides and herbicides, where the research by the CDC suggests somewhere between 95–96% of all the pesticides and herbicides are in the meat tissues. So when we lower on the spectrum, like a vegan, we minimize our exposure. So there's a major connection in that way. Now, the second major connection is sugar. Sugar increases rates of diabetes significantly, and that is increasing all over the world, the amount of sugar people are taking. Now, it used to be that you couldn't really get sugar so easily, and it was only seasonal. You know, the caveman, there were berries and a few things like that, but now it's all the time. And the amount of sugar people taking in is huge. People estimate, and I think it's an underestimation, about 52 teaspoons a day. Now, that's not me. I'm not doing that, but the general diet out there. Okay, and that's important. Now we add one other factor. It's called soft drinks. On the average, you have about 10 teaspoons per can of soft drink. That's one problem. The soft drinks have been associated with major increases in rates of diabetes. Now, as it is in research, there's variables. So some people talk about 10 times more, some people talk 1,000 times more rates of diabetes. I'm just citing the range where we increase. And these are studies with thousands of people all over the world. And on top of it, the quote, dietetic sodas are even worse. Depending on how many you have, because there's lots of little statistics on that, the dietetic with your MSG and the aspartame and so forth that they add to it actually increase the rate of diabetes somewhere between 15 to 50 to up to 60%, depending on how much you're taking, what kind of drink you're having. So the data's in. The dietetic sodas actually make it worse than just a regular soda. Now, why is that? Well, some of the studies are suggesting that the MSG, as well as the aspartame, are associated with disrupting the function of the hypothalamus. And that throws off your blood sugar regulation. That's one thing. Now with MSG, there are glutamate receptors in the beta cells of the pancreas, so it literally immediately stimulates a high blood sugar from the MSG. So these things are a problem on multiple levels. They also are associated with basically brain cell destruction, which always makes things worse. So there's lots of pieces associated with this. Bottom line, stay away from your aspartame, stay away from your MSG, eat lower in the food chain, eat organic, and life gets simpler but also far less diabetogenic. People are just beginning to understand that type 2 diabetes has doubles or maybe 2.5 times the rate of Alzheimer's. And there are particular mechanisms involved. Our muscles get insulin resistant, our liver gets insulin resistant, and then our brain also gets insulin resistant. Now that's a problem because we need sugar to make our brain work. It's the main fuel. Actually, the fact is that fatty acids work better, but that's not the point. The point is the brain, when it becomes insulin resistant, starts to block glucose getting into the brain and therefore fueling brain function. Now, this particularly affects certain parts of the brain that are associated with memory. Okay, so it's more affected that way. So what we see with the Alzheimer's is those parts of the brain that are affected by not having sugar deteriorate more quickly. So there's a real direct correlation. There is more to it in that we have seen by just giving coconut oil a reversal in some cases of Alzheimer's, because that coconut oil creates a fuel for the brain that's even better than sugar, and we can repair those areas of the brain that are associated with memory loss. So that's really the key. But the main principle is the brain gets insulin resistant. The way we end insulin resistance, this is really important, is we go on a moderately low glycemic diet. Okay, and what I mean by that is, except for vegetables, this is what I do in my program, what I do when I'm working with people, is I say until your blood sugar is less than 100, fasting blood sugar, avoid fruits, white flour, white sugar, junk food, and meat, all of which kind of raise the sugar in the system. Okay, so when we do that, we start to, meat also increases insulin secretion. So when we decrease the insulin secretion by doing all this, and just add your vegetables, sea vegetables, nuts, and seeds, we get a much lower glucose, insulin-stimulating diet. And therefore, the insulin, as it lowers, and they stay lower long enough, then we move out of insulin resistance in the brain. Now, in my work with diabetics, it is a major problem, is cognitive decline. And even in a few weeks of this intense program, there are major improvements in brain function. So this doesn't take years necessarily, but when you're really focused on it, you can move out of insulin resistance in the brain within 3 weeks. So it's good news. But if you keep going in a certain way, yes, we're talking about doubling the rate, at least, of Alzheimer's for those reasons. There are other reasons associated with meat eating, which again is part of the driving force behind insulin. So 99% of the meat that's available today is from CAFO, factory farmed. And factory farm animals have a certain, I don't know if we call it a virus, but it's like a virus in it. It's like mad cow disease. And what we find is that people who eat factory farm meat and chicken and so forth have 3 times more, I'm going to say not just cognitive decline, but also Alzheimer's. That's the newer research out there, because there is a certain infective agent in that, that meat. So there are lots of pieces involved with this. So not only you get more diabetes, but you also get this infective agent if you're having factory farm animals. So in the research that's out there, from the diabetes angle, which is my interest, somewhere between, depending on actually your genotype, and what I'm gonna explain is that different races have different responses. We get between 40 and 80% increase in the rates of diabetes. That's really significant, okay, from statins. So some cultures have 40%, and it goes all the way up to really 78%. I'm going to call it 80%. So statins definitely increase the rate of diabetes. They also increase your blood sugar. So if you already have diabetes, statins, the research shows statins increase your blood sugar by 39 points. If you don't have diabetes, statins will increase your blood sugar about 7 to 9 points. So the mechanism is not totally clear. The first step in the research is, well, this happens. So a lot of people come to me who are on statins, and the research is very clear. I'm talking about AMA type level of research over the last 30 years. Cholesterol is not a problem. Cholesterol between 160 and 260 is safe. Women with a cholesterol of 270 live 28% longer than women with a cholesterol of 193 or less. So we're not worried about the cholesterol issues unless you're above 260. Now, that's 30 years of research that really came out in the Journal of Archives of Internal Medicine, 2009. Okay, so that's clear. So people are still getting put on statins to lower the cholesterol when they don't really need to. But now we're saying, wait, but there's a problem here because you're really increasing your rates of diabetes in a major way. So I always take people off the statins because, one, they don't need it, but two, because it really has been associated with increasing rates of diabetes and also increasing your blood sugar. And worse if you have diabetes. As I say, 39-point raise in your blood sugar versus 9 points if you don't have diabetes. So it is definitely a problem, and it's something that we can face because the data is clearly there. There are other problems with statins. They're involved with memory loss and mental confusion and muscle aches and pains. But I'm talking in terms of diabetes here. And so they are definitely a problem, as I say, generally speaking, between 40 and 80% increase, depending on your racial background. That's the point I'm making. It is a genetically, how sensitive you are is genetically determined. So there are roles for statins, but generally speaking, the estimate is about 70% of the people receiving statins, it's not really needed. So generally everybody with diabetes, most people come in on statins, we take it off as part of helping them heal. So I don't recommend statins with diabetes unless your cholesterol really is above 260.